How's it going, everybody? That Spain video that I promised is going to have to wait at least one more day because weekend, busy with family, yada yada yada. Let's talk about something else just for now. As we all know by now, the Nintendo Switch 2 sales have absolutely stumbled over the Christmas holiday. In pretty much every single market, it has sold embarrassingly lower than anybody could have possibly expected after its amazing launch. Even in Japan, where it has the best attachment rate, it's sold fewer units now than the 2017 Switch did. And in most markets that it launched all around the world, where it had a launch that was 2 or 3 times the launch of the Nintendo Switch, it's gotten to the point where the year closes off, and now either it's flush with the Switch, it's slightly lower than the Switch, or it's between 5 and 8-ish% ahead of the Switch 1 back in 2017. So basically, that massive lead that it had against the console completely dissipated, and given that the original Switch gained significantly more momentum and started fairly slow because it was coming off the Wii U, this is a very bad sign of things to come for the Switch 2 unless something completely changes. The most obvious thing being the price. It's too high. As a matter of fact, according to Chris Drink from thegamebusiness.com, a senior Nintendo employee, so I'm assuming he has a plug somewhere in Nintendo of Europe, has stated that this embarrassingly poor Christmas in comparison to the Christmas of 2017 for the Switch 1 is largely due to the higher price points, something which I don't really need to talk about right now because I think yesterday's video covered that, as well as the absence of a major Western game. That latter point, the absence of a major Western game, that's the one that I want to focus on today. Because I could have sworn that I had spent months talking about the fact that we don't have a holiday title for the Nintendo Switch 2, specifically in Western markets. In Japan, the Switch 2 is going to sell, regardless, right? You have Pokemon doing pretty good over there, even though a majority of its sales are on the Switch 1. Kirby Air Riders, I mean, it's not doing as well as all the other Kirby titles, but it is a Kirby spin-off, so it's still doing pretty well, especially over there in comparison to the West, where it's pretty much flopped in every single market. And I mean, obviously, Hyrule Warriors, by now everyone's got Breath of the Wild fatigue, and they got the Warriors fatigue too, probably, so it's not going to do nearly as well as you'd expect. And Metroid Prime 4 did something very terrible. They couldn't even appeal to its own fandom, let alone attract newcomers into the series, by more or less doing to Metroid Prime what the most recent Anaconda did to the previous Anaconda movie from 30 years ago. What I especially like about this quote is that this is coming from a senior Nintendo employee specifically saying there's an absence of a major Western game. That's very important for me to just kind of bask in for a second. Because, you know, part of my I Told You So tour that I've been doing for the past month or so, I don't think I really got to stress this as much as I would have liked to. And honestly, I'm not exactly sure where I should begin because there are quite a few talking points that could be used to address this conversation. So first things first, let's talk about the Nintendo Switch's 2017, because for some strange reason, I feel like the Switch 2 corporate loyalists have had a really hard time wrapping their brain around this. The Nintendo Switch 1's launch was great for a few different reasons. Number one, most importantly, as always, is the price point, $300. That's a great price in 2017. That's a great price today, obviously. Number two, it's a handheld Nintendo console with the hybrid thing going, and it's playing the modern games. Like, that's the gimmick of the console. That appeals to people in and of itself. There was nothing seen like it before. And number three, the open world of Breath of the Wild was a revolutionary title. Levels of revolution in which we probably haven't seen in a Nintendo title since that game launched, and that's why they keep going back to the same formula. These alone will bring numbers. They will bring so many people to the table. In the US, Breath of the Wild had a higher pre-order rate than the actual Switch because there weren't enough units for people to pre-order, but people still wanted to make sure they had a copy of Breath of the Wild, so they bought it even knowing they were going to get the Switch eventually. That is absurd. And even in addition to that, I think Breath of the Wild sold like over 1 million copies on the Wii U, which was done by that point in time. In and of itself, like, people were buying it regardless of which version they wanted. This is done without discounts and without bundles in the same way that we saw for Mario Kart World. Every successful Nintendo console has had these three things: the good price point, the revolutionary title, and the gimmick that attracts people to the table. So for example, the Nintendo Entertainment System launches with Super Mario Bros. Success. The price is right, the game is captivating, and the whole NES package in and of itself was a revolution. That was the gimmick, especially in the States. Sure, there might be other companies that were doing something similar, but the NES proved to be a revolution in that regard. There's a minor drop-off with the SNES because there's more competition now, but you'd be hard-pressed to call it a failure in that market. It's got the 4 buttons plus the additional shoulder buttons, the parallax scrolling, the glorious jump to 16-bit, which was a lot more of an appealing graphical jump to the casual audience than simply going from 1080p to 4K, which in general isn't the most important thing in the world to the casual audience. So SNES still has revolutions and gimmicks to an extent, still has the great price, and still has an excellent launch title. People felt like they had to play Super Mario World. Then you have the Nintendo 64. There's another drop-off, but it was still considered a commercial success by many measures. The right price, the analog control of Mario in a 3D space, that was the gimmick, that was the part that appealed to many people. Heck, the 4 controller ports alone, that was a big drawing point as well. And then of course, as time went on, you got the rumble in there as well. Like there's a lot of things with the Nintendo 64 that was very revolutionary for the time that appealed to many people. And obviously, Super Mario 64, like, do I need to say anything about it? You can watch my retrospective over on Nintending Plus if you want to hear about it. When you move on to the GameCube, in many ways the GameCube is more or less just a sequel to the Nintendo 64. Very similar to what we saw in the jump from the Wii to the Wii U. You got the second analog stick in there, but at that point it's industry standard, really. Plus, in comparison to the competition, they didn't really give the second analog stick that much respect. It's a little C-stick nub. They got the price right with the GameCube, so they at least got one thing right, but unfortunately they did not have that killer launch title. Luigi's Mansion was just not enough to draw in the masses. And really, this is especially when you're competing with Halo on the Xbox and the PlayStation 2 with all of its glory. By industry standards, by Nintendo's own standards, I think GameCube is actually considered a commercial failure to an extent. Like, it sold about 2/3 of the units that the Nintendo 64 did, and it did so in a smaller gaming market in comparison because it launched later. I would say the GameCube can either be considered the best of the worst consoles, or the worst of the best consoles, in regards to success. But really, it all comes down to that of those 3 things, they only got one thing right on there, that being the price. I could argue that if they had 2 out of the 3 things right, they might have still succeeded. I don't know if Mario Sunshine being a launch title would have made that big of a difference. Maybe if it was marketed better as a direct sequel to Super Mario 64, they could have leaned into that a bit. But I think with a proper title in there, they got the right price point, they got a title in there that could compete somehow in sales numbers with Halo, for example. And it won't necessarily beat out the PlayStation 2, but it will have a much better console generation, even if it doesn't bring a gimmick to the table. And next up, the Wii is kind of an obvious one. You got the consoles at a great price. You have the Wii Sports and the motion controls. I don't really need to go into that. And then all of that is completely out the window with the Wii U, with the exception of the gimmick, which is the screen, the gamepad. Obviously, the gamepad came with its own issues. The title of the console came with an issue with the marketing. What you could do with the gamepad also was kind of a concern for many people. There were a lot of peripherals that were added onto the Wii. So the Wii U gamepad is it a new console? Is it just like an add-on? That obviously confused a lot of people. But even if it didn't, you still struggle with a pretty big jump in price from the Wii to the Wii U. You know, at $250, you had a Wii with the pack-in title. If you wanted the Wii U with the pack-in title in Nintendo Land, you had to pay $350. So it's like a 40% increase in the price compared to the last generation. And unfortunately, the launch title is just not there. There were some phenomenal Wii U titles that came later on, but they weren't ready for launch. So they kind of made it appealing with the gimmick. I don't think they were able to really reach the audience that they expected though, but they didn't have the major game, nor did they have the right price. And like I said, they kind of remedied that with the Switch. You can somewhat see similar patterns through all of the handheld jumps that we saw with Nintendo, but the difference is the only time they really kind of took the wrong step was with the 3DS. I think similar to the Wii U, I don't know if the 3D was as amazing to the masses in the same way the gamepad necessarily wasn't as amazing to the masses. So they somewhat got the gimmick wrong, but even then, if you remove the gimmick, they have the wrong price and not a major game that people feel obligated to buy. Thankfully, with the 3DS, they remedied that by dropping the price within the first year and releasing a lineup of very good, appealing games for the masses, not least of which being Super Mario 3D Land, which you can watch on my retrospective channel as well. In the case of all of the consoles that I've gone through, they've all had some very amazing games come out in the first year that were in addition to those titles that I specifically mentioned, but those titles are all groundbreaking, especially as a launch title. It's something that not only appeals to Nintendo fans, but it appeals to everybody, and it brings them all in. In many ways, those launch titles sell the consoles. Whereas in contrast to something like Luigi's Mansion for the GameCube, for example, because you bought a GameCube, you're kind of buying Luigi's Mansion at launch, because that's the game that's available. It's a good game, don't get me wrong. It's a great game. I love Luigi's Mansion. But that's as a Nintendo fan buying a Nintendo console interested in the Nintendo title. When it comes to the Switch 2, the reality is that's kind of what Bonanza is. You know, by the time the Nintendo Switch 2 had shipped out 10.36 consoles in the last meeting, those were the sell-in numbers, which mean shipped, right? So interestingly, they also mentioned that Donkey Kong Bonanza also had sold in roughly 3.5 million units or whatever the number was exactly. So this made a lot of people assume that 33% of all Switch 2 owners actually own Donkey Kong Bonanza. But then a couple days after they released that, Nintendo did a presentation where they talked about actual sold through units of Donkey Kong Bonanza. Remember, sold through is what's sold, sell in is what's shipped, and Nintendo has not shared a sold through number for the Switch 2 since the 6 million that were sold back in July. But it turned out that Donkey Kong Bonanza had only sold actually to customers by like mid-October, 2.6 million units. And the funny thing is, the Circana estimates around that time was that Donkey Kong Bonanza had sold in the States alone about 1.3 million units. So that means worldwide, outside the States, Donkey Kong Bonanza, at that point in time, when there was 10.36 million units shipped, had only actually sold 1.3 million copies of Donkey Kong Bonanza in the States, and then 1.3 million copies everywhere else. Now, I kind of addressed this in a previous video. I'm still of the opinion that Donkey Kong Bonanza had a 1 in 3 selling rate, but that's because I think that at the end of the September, the Switch 2 had only actually sold through to customers about 7.5 million units. Then you can watch my long analysis video. I have bookmarks in there if you're interested in that when I discuss it. But the point is that while I think Donkey Kong Bonanza might actually be an amazing title and appeal to a lot of people, it's not strong enough to do it on its own. And we've already established that while Pokemon Legends ZA is going to sell well, it's still a Switch 1 game, and it's doing much better on the Switch 1 than it is the Switch 2. And even more than that, it's doing significantly more units in Japan than it's doing everywhere else. So for Western markets, that doesn't really help its case that much, because what's left over after you subtract the Japanese sales, and then you also subtract the majority of sales, which are Switch 1 consoles, are numbers that, while they're good, they're not quite that revolutionary title that moved so many different consoles type of success. Now, make no mistake, this is not me saying that these two games are failures, Pokemon and Donkey Kong Bonanza. This is more me trying to explain to you why even the senior that works at Nintendo, has basically admitted that the Switch 2 sales have struggled partially because they did not have a killer game for Western audiences. Now, if you've been following my channel long enough, none of that quote should surprise you. I've been making these claims since prior to the games even coming out, and I even analyzed them after they came out every time we got sales data for them, which was a very big reason as to why, going into the November holiday season, I was very confident that it was going to struggle big time during the holidays outside of Japan. And when the Switch 2 failed to meet the demand that you would have expected in the holiday season, I knew these games were going to be the reason why, or rather the reliance on these games. Because to reiterate, I'm not sitting here trying to convince you as to why I may have been right. I'm sitting here telling you that I am right, and I have a senior from Nintendo effectively agreeing with everything that I've been saying the past few months. This is no longer a debate or a video of me trying to convince you otherwise. This is now me trying to explain why things are the way they are. Pokemon being a cross-gen game and being heavily towards the Switch 1 over the Switch 2, plus Bonanza for the Switch 2, are just not those Breath of the Wild titles. And obviously, in addition to that, the next thing that most people are going to mention is Mario Kart World. But, like I said before, Mario Kart World is French fries. French fries are usually the best-selling item on the menu because everybody orders them with every single item that they go to the store for. So if I go buy a Nintendo console, I'm buying it for a Breath of the Wild, I'm buying it for a Mario Odyssey, I may even be buying it for a Metroid title or a Mario game, whatever it might be. And then since I decided to buy a Nintendo console, I gotta get my side of fries. That's a very big reason why Mario Kart has always been one of the best-selling games on every Nintendo console. Whether the console is a success or a failure, you're buying the Nintendo console either for the price, for the gimmick, or for the main game that really draws people in, and then once you grab it, you get your side of fries. And this is stressed even more with how often Mario Kart is bundled with every single one of these consoles. So sometimes it's just the best deal out there. 3DS, Wii U, Wii, Switch, Switch 2. All of the best bundles are always out there where somebody's kind of like, well, I'm buying the console, I might as well get the Mario Kart bundle. And oftentimes it's actually a better deal to get it with the Mario Kart bundle than without. In the case of the Switch 2, it was actually more expensive to get it with the Mario Kart bundle, but that's not always the case. And to reiterate, we are well beyond the point where I have to convince you as to why the Switch 2 has struggled in the holiday season. Rather, I am not convincing, I am explaining because the Nintendo senior agrees with what I've been saying. There is no killer game that gets people to buy the Switch 2 in the Western markets. And seeing as how almost every single Switch 2 that was available and moved off of the shelves was a Mario Kart game bundle, And it still led to the worst holiday season for Nintendo in over a decade. I think that more than proves my point, and especially the point that was made by the Nintendo Senior, that Mario Kart World is not a killer app that will move units. Now, I've spent the most time talking about Bonanza, Pokemon, and Mario Kart World. Obviously, I don't know that I need to spend any more time talking about Kirby and Metroid and Hyrule Warriors. I'm hoping by now people understand that sometimes a single game can be more than the sum of its parts when it comes to what's released on a console in a given year. And again, this is not to say that any of those games are bad. I will say some of those games are bad. But Kirby Air Riders, I know is fun. I haven't played it, but I know it's fun. I can tell. I'm a Kirby Air Ride fan. And I made a video about it when they first decided that it was going to be coming out in November. Amongst all of the fun comments of disagreements that I got back then when I said that this was not a proper holiday title, was obviously many people disagreeing with me. But even better than that was after the Kirby Directs and after all of the YouTubers were pushing about how great and phenomenal the game is and how everybody was like, the hype is up there and the game is amazing and this is absolutely the best racing game of 2025. Better than Sonic Racing Cross Worlds and Mario Kart World even. And everybody circled back to that video and started commenting about how it aged like milk. But unfortunately for them, the only thing that actually aged like milk was their stupid comment. Because my argument was that Kirby Air Riders was going to probably be a good game, and Sakurai was probably going to do a great job with it. But the unfortunate reality is that that's not a holiday title that's going to move units. And again, this is not my opinion now, this is fact based off of the Nintendo Senior Officer. I defer to them. And in addition to all of that, you have all of the third-party titles that have came in for the Switch 2, whether they're massive and very popular games like FIFA and Madden, Cyberpunk, or embarrassing failures that nobody really liked like Star Wars Outlaws. The reality is those do not move Nintendo consoles. It's not to say that it's not good that they're on the Nintendo consoles, but when a new FIFA game comes out, if somebody wants a PlayStation 5 that doesn't already have one, that's the first console they're thinking about buying to play that third-party title. GTA 6, that's going to be cross-platform. It's going to be on PC as well. You don't think it's going to do phenomenal numbers for the PlayStation? Same thing with all of the shooters. People are actually going to go out of their way to buy one of these consoles if they don't already have it to play those games on there. To an extent, this happened with the original Switch for indie games, for example, where in the last gen, people were like, oh, I want to play these games on the go. And this will continue on with the Nintendo Switch 2, but the only thing is most of these indie titles are still going to be available on the Switch 1, so if somebody has a Switch 1, they don't need to buy a Switch 2 to play those. And obviously, there's all of the different ways to play Steam games now that people have been experiencing, so they buy these games on there too. But ultimately, no matter how big a third-party title is, it's not going to move Switch consoles. It's just a nice added bonus. And more often than not, ends up not even being worth being on the Nintendo console for that third-party developer that's putting it on there. A waste of their time and money because Nintendo fans want to play Nintendo games more than anything else. And again, this is not what I'm saying, this is what the guy from Nintendo told Chris Dring. There is no killer game, there is no massive game that appeals to the Western markets. I am no longer trying to convince you of these things. The reality is, when you're talking about comparing year ones, and you're talking about comparing launches between the Switch 1 and the Switch 2, because that's what people keep trying to go back towards, right? They're like, oh, how could you complain about the Switch 2? What did the Switch 1 have? This is way better. Even if Bonanza, Mario Kart, Hyrule Warriors, Kirby, Metroid, even if these are games that are loved by Nintendo fans, and they love the idea of playing NBA at 30 frames per second. It doesn't mean it's not a good launch lineup. But when you're looking at sales numbers and successes and what ultimately leads to a console doing well in its first year all the way through, including in the holidays. Actually, not even including, especially in the holidays. That's usually when the scales skyrocket. Nothing the Nintendo Switch 2 has is Breath of the Wild. Nothing. Even if you put them all together, Pokemon, Bonanza, Mario Kart, somebody goes in there and is like, oh, these are 3 very good games, they think. I mean, I would rather play these 3 than Breath of the Wild anyway. None of them have that Nintendo launch title impact that Breath of the Wild had, Wii Sports had, Mario 64 had, all the way dating back to Super Mario Bros. Had. And I think for almost the entirety of 2025, Nintendo fans struggled to grasp this concept. Which is very weird to me because nobody except those Nintendo fans are the ones that glazed Breath of the Wild to this extent. I know this because me and everybody watching this channel and watching this video right now, because most of you are Nintendo fans who are just upset with the way the market is going, maybe you disagree now, but you cannot deny how either you or the majority of people had felt when they were playing Breath of the Wild the first time in 2017, and just how much hype it continued to build off of that initial launch. So it's amazing to me that all of these Switch 2 folks are trying to pretend that anything the Switch 2 has is more valuable to move units than what Breath of the Wild did back in 2017. And let me just make something very clear. Despite being a massive Nintendo fan, I'm not the biggest Zelda fan. Like, don't get me wrong, I enjoy my Zelda games, but I've always been a Mario guy. Like, for me, that's what I associate Nintendo with. And I like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but like, they don't rank even in the best games that I've ever played. I think they're excellent games, but they're not necessarily like my style of game. I may have played Breath of the Wild before Mario Odyssey, but that's only because only Breath of the Wild was out before Mario Odyssey came out. When I think of the launch year for the Nintendo Switch, it's not Breath of the Wild that really pulled me in as much as Mario Odyssey. Mario Odyssey was like the main reason I wanted that console. Aside from the fact that, you know, the Joy-Cons was really cool and the fact that it detached from the screen and all that gimmicky stuff. But even I have to call it for what it is. Breath of the Wild, the reality is that moved the consoles at launch. And then Odyssey took it to heights that were unimaginable. Odyssey, when it first came out, eclipses anything that any Switch 2 game has done and realistically will do during this generation. We hadn't seen a 3D Mario collectathon, depending on who you ask, probably since the 90s. Some people would say Sunshine. And my opinion of this has kind of shifted as I've gone through all of the 3D Mario games in my retrospectives in depth, but I know for a fact that when I play Odyssey, it was the first time since Mario 64 that I felt like we actually got a sequel to Mario 64. And it's not like I thought that 3D World and 3D Land and the Galaxy games were bad, it's just that when Odyssey came out, we were very much ready for that type of amazing 3D Mario experience. As a matter of fact, a very large reason as to why 3D World is so beloved as it is when it came to the Switch is because we got Odyssey first. In a post-Odyssey world, 3D World thrives because Odyssey took care of that itch that many people had for decades. But if instead in the first year of the Switch's life they decided to port over 3D World, it never would have been seen in such a good light. Breath of the Wild basically set the ball up and Mario Odyssey spiked it down. And both games had worldwide appeal. None of this whole thing where it's like, well, it did good in that market, but not in this one, and this game's gonna do better over here, but not necessarily do as well over here. These were both the perfect games to launch a new console with. You actually didn't need anything else. But if you wanted more, you had good third-party titles you can grab. You had Bomberman, which would scratch an 8-player itch. You had Snipper Clips, which was very beloved for many people because it allowed you to test out using 2 Joy-Cons. You obviously got Mario Kart 8 Deluxe because everybody's got to order their side of fries, right? You bought a Nintendo console, you're going to pay a little bit more for the combo. But it was that quick 1-2, not 1-2 switch, that quick 1-2 of Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey, that carried the game through that entire 2017 and actually beyond 2017. And I firmly believe that to an extent, Nintendo arrogantly thought that would carry it through 2025 as well. They increased the price of the 2 Zelda games, spent an ample amount of time talking about both of them during its Direct in April, and launched them as first-party launch titles for the new Switch 2 console. And likewise, the updates for Odyssey and additional games like 3D World, for example, would further be able to convince people to jump into this new console so they can play them with the up-res and frame rate. And many people actually thought that was a very smart decision and would help move Switch 2 units throughout the year. But, and this is no longer my opinion, now it's the opinion of a Nintendo officer, they obviously were not going to be games that would move consoles in Western markets. Because they already did. The very few Nintendo fans in the West that actually decided it was worth buying the Switch 2 in its first year, a small portion of them very well may feel like they're enjoying the Switch 2 in 2025 more than they did the Switch in 2017. And they might feel like this lineup is better than what they got back then. And who knows, maybe if I had bought a Switch 2, I might have felt the same way. But the reality is, their opinion is very much the vocal minority, because the Western markets have proven that the Nintendo Switch 2 has greatly struggled in its first year due to a lack of a killer app. Almost all of its sales were entirely because the people that wanted to buy the next Nintendo console got a hold of it, regardless of the price, but they did not have a Nintendo caliber, a top-tier, top-notch Nintendo caliber system seller to convince the masses to buy in the same way they did in all of their previous successful Nintendo consoles. And again, to reiterate, this is no longer me stating my opinion. This is a fact from a senior Nintendo employee that stated that the Switch 2 did not have a major Western game. I'll catch you guys next time.